So let's now focus on the testing part of this code base, of this architecture, of this design. We are starting with the integration test, or maybe it should be called system tests, because this is what I showed at the beginning. It is testing the web layer, the domain layer, together with the database layer. So everything together, and it's only the happy path once the happy paths are less happy, because right now there is actually only happy path. But later on, it's not a level that we want to cover all the tests with, because will get too big. Once the number of bounded contexts will grow, there is no point in testing everything at the integration level. Another level which you can test on is with, so in here we are indirectly testing the controllers. We don't really have tests for controllers, and I don't think they make sense with this kind of tests. But we can also test actually the level of commands and command handlers. So starting as the commands as the main place, as the main API, as the main facade. I don't have this kind of test in here. I just want to explain you that we don't need Rails for that. So we could have tests which operate at the level of commands, and there is a real command path, there is a real event store, so there will be probably a real database under the hood. But you could also replace it with in-memory database, for example. But overall, you will be testing the bounded contexts together, so it is an integration test, but without the Rails, the HTTP layer, and without the Rails infrastructure. So Rails doesn't have to be even loaded in this kind of integration test where we skip the controllers, for example, because the controllers usually are quite simple. And there are the unit tests now. So now 3 levels of testing. There are the pyramid of testing. And the unit tests, I think they are the most important in here. So as I said, we have aggregate and read models. And those are the things that I showed today. There are some other building blocks, but for today, let's focus on that. What I think is that with the aggregate is a nice unit. At some point, aggregate actually can be more classes than just one. We call them, it's an aggregate root. It contains references to other classes. It could be value objects. And the read model is actually basically just a wrapper on active record, for example. Let's start with the aggregate. And as you see, we have the aggregate tests in the workshops. So it can be even separated to a separate gem. You can run just the tests for the workshops namespace, bounded context. And in here we just test that when we initialize participant, it's loaded with events, and you register for addition. So you are calling a public method. In a way, you are handling a command. And then you expect the participant to have some events applied. We have RSpec matchers for that. So in here you can use have published, have applied, and so on. And in here we want to just see that an event has been published. So from a unit point of view, an aggregate point of view, this is really cool, because an aggregate, all it has as an output is a collection of new events, which means we can test it as a black box. So we say, initialize with this, like run this method, this method, this method, which means it will be like loaded from events at the end. And then run this method and expect that new events will be published. And that's super easy to test. The aggregates, usually they don't really have getters, so you don't have to test whether some kind of specific state is inside. You just test the effect, the output. You don't really test the internals in here. And that's really important, because it simplifies a lot the testing part. And the aggregates are super easy to test in that case. So that's and you see there is really not that much, because really we don't really make any real decisions in the aggregate. But you can imagine that if we have addition as an aggregate, as I said in the first part, or the second part, then we can say that if there's more than 20 people, we don't agree for that. Maybe it can be tested through the aggregate, maybe not. But at least this is a place to make decisions. We are testing the decisions. We are testing whether the events were published. So this is testing whether the decisions were made. Now let's go to the read models, and note an important part. Read model belongs to the app directory. It lives as part of the Rails application. So why is it there? And I'm saying that the other bounded context should be like separate. I'm saying that this should be very clear to me from just joining the project. What is the project about? But this is where the whole distinction between the application layer and the domain layer comes into place. The application layer is all about the specific application needs. In our case, it's a web application. We can imagine this being served by some kind of web frontend. And in our case, the read models are optimized and are specific for the application, for the UI of this application, for the main client of this application. So we want to have read models per client of the application. If our app also exposes another API for the mobiles, you would have special read models for the mobiles because maybe they have different optimized needs for the data, and maybe you can use GraphQL, for example, for implementing the read models. But maybe you just go with the plain old, active record. So the read model lives actually in the application structure. It knows about the events in the domain, but it only knows as in accessing this. It doesn't really, read models, they don't change anything. They don't change the domain. Read models don't change the domain. Read models don't publish events. Read models just accept events and store the data structure. So we can also test it very easily. Right, this is the request spec. That's not. So you can see at the Rails testing level, we have the request spec, so the integration tests or the system level tests. And then we have participants read model spec. So because this lives also in the application, this belongs in here. And this is super easy testing, handle whether it's handling an event, whether the collection is of the right size, whether the data is correct. And this is just the assertions in here to test that all the data fits. It's super easy. More or less we are just testing aggregate, active record here. But active record is just internal implementation. So it's also a nice thing here that we almost perfectly are not relying on the participant active record here. The read model implementation can be changed to, I don't know, to something in memory, to Redis, to some other fancy NoSQL database. It doesn't really matter because we are not really relying on the active record part. We are just relying on this facade. So we are testing through participants read model. And I think that's a very important part. So to repeat, the read model is a nice unit. It deserves its own tests. But it lives in the Rails application, so it can live with other tests in the Rails application. Aggregate is part of the domain, it's part of the bounded context. It can be tested and should be probably tested at the level of the bounded context. So if we move the workshops directory somewhere else, so make physical separation, we move the tests together with that. And the tests could be run without Rails. This code has nothing to do with Rails. We don't test, in this approach that I've shown, we don't test command and command handlers directly. It's only called with this request specs. But that's because I don't have an example here which would be worth showing at some point. I don't have an example where I don't use Rails, but I use commands as the input. So I'm not calling directly the aggregate, I'm calling the commands at the beginning, and then I'm testing the output in the form of events, because actually not the form of events. We can then test the integration test together with the read models, so we can test whether the read model is fine. But still, you don't have to do it with Rails, but it depends how you initialize the read model overall. But you don't really use the controllers and stuff from the typical Rails application. So that's the strategy for testing that I've been using here for this kind of event-driven application. I think this is one of the main benefits of using this approach, even from the beginning, because with the Rails way approach, you have to test a lot of things through the attributes. So you just do some data and then check whether the active record attribute is this or that. Or you test at the JSON level, so you go with really a very big integration level, which also means it's really hard to cover all edge cases this way. And this is more expensive, I would say, than testing the units. So that's the strategy for testing an event-driven Rails application, which was written event-driven from scratch.